What actually happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath is far more profound than most people realize. On the surface, it may look like just another breakup, another emotional drama, another separation between two individuals who simply didn't work out. But beneath that surface lies a deep psychological and spiritual shift, one that reshapes identity, energy, and emotional awareness. To understand this, we must first understand the emotional dynamic between these two personalities. An empath does not merely love. An empath absorbs, reflects, stabilizes, and nourishes emotional environments. They are highly attuned to the inner states of others. A narcissistic personality, on the other hand, depends heavily on external validation to regulate internal instability. The empath becomes more than a partner. They become an emotional regulator. Spiritually, this creates an energetic loop. The empath gives reassurance. The narcissist receives it. The empath forgives. The narcissist avoids accountability. The empath repairs emotional ruptures. The narcissist maintains control. Over time, this dynamic becomes a system of imbalance disguised as intimacy. But when the empath awakens, when they recognize their worth and withdraw their emotional supply, the system collapses. The first spiritual consequence is the loss of reflection. A narcissistic identity is often constructed around how others respond to them. Admiration becomes proof of value. Attention becomes proof of existence. When the empath leaves, the mirror disappears. And without that mirror, the narcissist is left alone with unfiltered self-perception. This can feel like ego collapse, not because love is gone, but because regulation is gone. Emotionally mature individuals develop internal stability over time. But when someone relies heavily on others to maintain self-worth, the sudden withdrawal of that support creates spiritual disorientation. The silence of the empath becomes louder than any argument ever was. Their absence removes the emotional cushioning that once softened reality. At this point, something deeper begins to happen. Without the empath absorbing tension, unresolved insecurities surface. Old wounds that were previously projected outward have nowhere to go. Blame loses its target. Control loses its leverage. And the narcissist may experience restlessness, anxiety, or a persistent need to replace the lost connection quickly. Why? Because the nervous system has become accustomed to emotional supply. Spiritually, this is a confrontation with the self. The empath's departure forces the narcissist into an encounter with internal emptiness, an emptiness that was previously masked by external validation. But here is the crucial truth. This moment is not punishment. It is opportunity. Loss, in psychological and spiritual terms, is a teacher. It removes illusions. It strips away distraction. It reveals patterns. When someone loses an empath, they lose access to unconditional emotional repair. And without that safety net, they are faced with two paths. The first path is avoidance, seeking new admiration, repeating old patterns, reconstructing the ego as quickly as possible to avoid discomfort. This path leads to deeper fragmentation because the core wound remains untouched. The second path is awareness. Awareness begins with discomfort. It begins with recognizing patterns of control, defensiveness, or emotional manipulation. It begins with asking difficult questions. Why did I need constant validation? Why did intimacy feel threatening? Spiritual growth does not happen in comfort. It happens in confrontation. Meanwhile, something equally powerful is happening on the other side. When the empath walks away, their energy returns to them. For a long time, they may have overextended themselves, overgiving, over-explaining, over-forgiving. Spiritually, this drains identity, but detachment restores it. The empath begins to reclaim clarity. Their nervous system stabilizes. Their intuition strengthens. They realize that love without reciprocity is not compassion. It is self-abandonment. And this realization shifts everything. The narcissist may interpret the empath's silence as indifference, but spiritually, it is boundary. It is self-respect. It is emotional maturity choosing peace over chaos. The most powerful transformation in this dynamic is not the narcissist's pain. It is the empath's awakening. Because once an empath understands their value, they do not return to dynamics that diminish them. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They no longer mistake control for passion. Spiritually, the loss becomes a catalyst for evolution. For the narcissist, this loss removes illusion. For the empath, it restores identity. And here is the deeper lesson for all of us. Any relationship built on imbalance will eventually reach a breaking point. Emotional systems that depend on one person overfunctioning while the other avoids growth cannot sustain harmony. When an empath leaves, it is not merely departure. It is disruption of dysfunction. If growth follows, the loss becomes redemption. If denial follows, the loss becomes repetition. But in both cases, something shifts permanently. So what actually happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath? Illusion collapses. Energy rebalances. Identity is tested, and both individuals stand at a crossroads, one towards self-awareness, the other towards self-reclamation. The real transformation is not in the drama of the ending. It is in the internal reconstruction that follows. And that is where true spiritual evolution begins. When a narcissist loses an empath, the first and most immediate spiritual shift is the collapse of emotional reflection, a phenomenon that is deeply rooted in how identity has been constructed over time. In many imbalanced relationships, the empath unconsciously becomes a mirror, constantly reflecting admiration, reassurance, validation, and emotional affirmation back to the narcissistic partner. This reflection does more than boost confidence. It stabilizes a fragile internal structure that depends heavily on external approval to maintain self-worth. Spiritually speaking, the narcissist's sense of identity often leans outward rather than inward, meaning their emotional equilibrium is regulated by how others respond to them rather than by an internally grounded sense of value. When the empath withdraws, no longer offering praise, no longer soothing conflicts, no longer repairing emotional ruptures, that mirror disappears. What remains is not simply loneliness, but unfiltered self-exposure. Without the empath absorbing tension and projecting back reassurance, the narcissist may feel a disorienting void, as though a stabilizing force has suddenly been removed. This can trigger restlessness, anxiety, or an urgent need to seek new validation, because the nervous system has grown accustomed to a steady stream of emotional supply. The spiritual discomfort that follows is not merely about missing a person, it is about confronting an identity that was partially constructed through another's devotion. In this silence, unresolved insecurities surface more clearly, and defenses that once felt powerful begin to feel brittle. The loss becomes a mirror of a different kind, one that reflects inward instead of outward. At this stage, the experience carries the potential for awareness because when external affirmation is stripped away, the individual is left with an essential question: who am I when no one is reinforcing my worth? This moment of confrontation, though uncomfortable, represents the beginning of genuine self-examination, where identity can either be reconstructed on deeper foundations or reinforced through avoidance and repetition. When the empath steps away, the second spiritual consequence that unfolds is the awakening of emotional consequences that were previously avoided or deflected. In an imbalanced dynamic, the empath often absorbs emotional turbulence, translating chaos into calm, anger into understanding, and distance into renewed connection. This buffering effect allows the narcissistic partner to bypass deep self-reflection because discomfort is consistently softened before it fully registers. Spiritually, this creates a pattern where actions do not feel internally costly. Blame can be projected outward, and accountability can be diluted by the empath's willingness to repair. However, once that emotional cushion is removed, there is no longer anyone mediating the impact of behavior. Words spoken in pride, manipulations used to maintain control, and dismissals of vulnerability no longer dissolve into forgiveness so easily. Instead, they echo in the silence left behind. The nervous system, once stabilized by constant reassurance, begins to experience dysregulation, and unresolved wounds that were long buried under layers of ego defense start to rise to the surface. This is often experienced as agitation, emptiness, or an unexplainable sense of loss that goes beyond missing companionship. Spiritually, it is the experience of emotional cause and effect becoming visible. Without someone to absorb projection, the individual is confronted with the raw imprint of their own behavior. The mind may initially resist this awareness, searching or distractions or replacements to reestablish familiar patterns. But beneath that resistance lies an undeniable recognition that something deeper has been exposed. This exposure can feel threatening because it challenges long-held self-perceptions of superiority or control. Yet within that discomfort is a rare opportunity to recognize that emotional maturity requires ownership of one's impact on others. When avoidance is no longer supported by someone else's compassion, the individual stands face to face with the emotional consequences of their choices, and that confrontation marks a pivotal spiritual turning point. The third spiritual shift that occurs when the empath walks away is an energetic rebalancing that transforms attachment into autonomy. In an imbalanced relationship, energy tends to flow disproportionately in one direction. The empath gives attention, reassurance, emotional labor, and patience, often at the expense of their own needs, while the narcissistic partner grows accustomed to receiving this steady stream of psychological reinforcement. Over time, this creates an attachment dynamic rooted not in mutual interdependence, but in dependency disguised as intimacy. Spiritually, energy that continually moves outward without equal return leads to depletion for one and inflation for the other. When the empath chooses detachment, that energetic current is interrupted. The flow that once fed the narcissist's sense of importance begins to return to its source. For the empath, this feels like clarity gradually replacing confusion, calm replacing hypervigilance, and strength replacing self-doubt. Their nervous system, once conditioned to anticipate emotional volatility, starts to stabilize. Boundaries that once felt frightening begin to feel protective. Meanwhile, the narcissistic partner experiences destabilization because the familiar channel of affirmation has been closed. What once felt guaranteed is now uncertain. The silence that follows is not merely absence. It is the sound of energy no longer being available on demand. This shift exposes the difference between attachment driven by need and connection grounded in reciprocity. Spiritually, autonomy emerges when the empath recognizes that love does not require self-sacrifice to the point of erosion. By reclaiming their emotional investment, they restore balance within themselves. The dynamic that once revolved around control and validation loses its foundation, and both individuals are confronted with a new reality, one where self-regulation must come from within rather than from external dependence. In this rebalancing, power is not taken from one and given to another. It simply returns to its rightful source, marking the beginning of independent growth and a deeper understanding of what healthy connection truly requires. The fourth spiritual movement that unfolds after the loss is the emergence of a crossroads, a decisive inner moment where transformation becomes possible, but not guaranteed. When the familiar cycle of validation, control, and emotional repair is no longer available, the narcissistic individual stands before an unfamiliar internal landscape. The usual defenses, denial, projection, superiority, may still activate, but they no longer function with the same efficiency because the external reinforcement that sustained them is weakened. Spiritually, this is the point at which fragmentation can either deepen or begin to heal. If avoidance continues, the discomfort of loss is quickly numbed through distraction, replacement relationships, or intensified ego protection. On the surface, life appears to move forward, yet the core wound remains untouched, growing more rigid over time. This path reinforces isolation, because each repetition of the pattern distances the individual further from authentic intimacy. However, there is another possibility hidden within the discomfort. The silence left by the empath can become a space for reflection rather than resistance. In that space, questions begin to surface. Questions about vulnerability, empathy, accountability, and the fear that may have driven controlling behaviors. This self-inquiry is not comfortable, but it is transformative. Spiritually, growth requires the dismantling of illusions that once protected the ego. It requires the humility to admit that love cannot thrive where domination replaces mutual respect. If the individual chooses awareness, the loss becomes catalytic rather than catastrophic. Patterns can be examined, emotional literacy can develop, and a more grounded sense of identity can begin to form, one that does not depend on constant admiration. At the same time, the empath's departure reinforces a universal truth. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty, but acts of alignment. In this crossroads moment, destiny is not dictated by the loss itself, but by the response to it. And that response determines whether the experience becomes a lesson in evolution or a cycle repeated indefinitely.